Good morning and welcome to Sunday School at First Baptist Church as we begin 2025, a new year. It's good to continue to study God's Word in this new year. We're still in the book of Exodus, chapters 15 through 18 today, where we're looking at the children of Israel in the wilderness. When you come to Christ and you know and experience His redeeming love and forgiveness, one might expect that from that point forward, everything is going to be a bed of roses, but it's not. It's still life, and there are problems that come. And in all of that, we need to learn to rely on the Lord. And that's what the children of Israel had to do. They're in the wilderness. They need to learn to rely on the Lord. They're really, if you think about it, very vulnerable people. About, as best people can guess who look at these things, about 2 million people walking across the desert, no reasonable supply of water, no security forces to protect them from enemies. And all they remember is Yahweh destroyed Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt, but that part's past. What's He going to do for me now? What's He going to do to help us in this time where we're out here in the wilderness? The wilderness really proved to be a kind of a proving ground for the children of Israel. It's there that the Lord put them to the test. Were you going to depend on me just for the big things or the day-to-day things, which really become big things if they're not taken care of? God tests those whom He calls, not in order to reject them, but that their dross may be consumed and their gold may be refined. So wrote Paige Kelly, and he's actually the truth. They're going to be refined out here in the desert. They're going to be tested, and God's going to help them to learn that they need to trust Him day to day, just for the day-to-day experiences. The celebratory song that Moses sang and the Israelites sang after the Red Sea deliverance went like this: "In your unfailing love, you will lead the people you have redeemed. In your strength, you will guide them to your holy dwelling." And between the lines, if you read that, it means in the day-to-day experiences. And chapter 14 is the story of Israel's salvation from the flight of the Egyptians into the desert. But salvation demands that you respond in the right way. God wants them to respond with their day-to-day belief and their day-to-day faith. The Lord brought them into this place, and He's going to help them through. He showed that the abundant love that He had for them would provide for these day-to-day needs, that He would, if they trusted Him, that they could expect that He would provide for their day-to-day needs. How often do we have to be at rock bottom, really, before we realize those things about what God's going to do for us? So let's begin this story of them learning that lesson here in the book of Exodus, chapter 15, with verses 22 through 27. The story says, "Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. That is why the place is called Marah." Marah means bitter. "So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, 'What are we to drink?' Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. There the Lord made a decree and a law for them, and there He tested them. He said, 'If you listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in His eyes, if you pay attention to His commands and keep all His decrees, I will not bring on any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you.' Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there near the water." There's nothing like an oasis in the desert to reinforce your faith. Marah was a place where the water was bitter. This is an interesting story. We don't know why the water was bitter, but God showed Moses a tree, a dead tree, that he could throw into the water, and the water would become sweet. We don't know if Moses learned this while he was tending his father-in-law's sheep in the desert for 40 years, or whether it's something God actually revealed to him, or whether God did this miracle in some other way. Whether it was a natural response to the wood that was in the tree that Moses had to throw into the water, or whether it was God doing it through this symbolic act, it was still a miracle, natural or divine. And then it says they came to Elim. And in Elim, they had all their needs met. They had 70 palm trees and they had 12 springs, refreshing place to stay and a refreshing place to be. But these people will have a short memory. Even when they leave Elim, they'll not remember what God has done for them in all these cases. Such as it is with most of us. It's not, what have you done for me, God, over a length of time? What have you done for me today? What have you done for me lately? We can't see the forest for the trees very often. I like what Alexander McLaren reminds us of at this point, that in recognition and of yielding to God's will, that is the one thing which for us changes all. The one secret of finding peace and of getting sweetness out of bitterness is obedience to the Lord. And this is really what God is looking for. This is going to be a time of testing for the people of Israel. He's going to test them. Are you going to be willing to obey what I tell you and believe what I tell you? You have to have faith, and God's going to test their faith. Let's look in chapter 16, beginning with verses 1 through 3. The whole Israelite community set out for Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into this desert to starve their entire assembly to death." What short memories. They just had gotten water, and now they say, we really wish we were back in Egypt. We had plenty to eat in Egypt. Man, they were in slavery too. The chronology of this indicates that it was about a month that they had been there. And then there's an interesting statement about being in the desert of Sin. And that's appropriate really when you look at it symbolically, but that stands for Sinai. They're in the desert close to the Mount of Sinai. Sounds descriptive though, doesn't it? The Israelites had been enslaved so long that they'd become infected with a slave mentality. They thought what they had as slaves in Egypt was way better than what they had here. They were living in the lap of luxury when they were in slavery. How ironic. That's the good old days mentality. The good old days are not always the good old days. They're just the old days. They remembered Egypt as a land of plenty, where they ate fish and cucumbers and melons, leeks, onions, and garlic, and had pots of meat cooking. The meat pots that they remembered may not have been quite as lavish as they might have thought. They're natural exaggerations, one writer says. What's so startling about these Israelites is that their grumbling is that it was accompanied by a desire to return to Egypt. That's amazing. Now delivered and set free, God's people want to return to slavery. Stunning. We remember the good old days. Unbelief has a short memory. The Red Sea, forgotten in a month. The destruction of the Egyptian army. There's a disconnect here. And the discontent creates that slippery memory that they have at this point. They don't want things just to go right. They want things to go perfect. And that's not the way life is. But God does solve the problems along the way, and they'll find that out. Look at verses 4 through 10 of chapter 16. Then the Lord said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the sixth day they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days." So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us?" Moses also said, "You will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses told Aaron, "Say to the entire Israelite community to come before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling." While Aaron was speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked toward the desert, and there was the glory of the Lord appearing in a cloud. God appears in two ways to them, as a tongue of fire and as glory in the cloud. And he says, "I'm going to test you. And after I test you and you see how I perform, you'll know. You'll know that I'm the Lord." He's going to demonstrate his deity. All through this first part of the book of Exodus here, God is telling them, watch what I do. It'll show you that I'm God. And so to test these people to see if their faith would be intact and be strong, that's his intent. Israel would walk in obedience to the Lord's instructions eventually, but they're going to go through this period of time where they show that they're willing to trust God. Notice also that when Moses talks about the bread that God's going to give to them from heaven, that it's daily. "Give us our daily bread," is what Jesus said in the Lord's Prayer. Meat to eat in the evening, bread to eat in the morning, more than you need. Jesus taught the daily dependence upon God when he said, "Don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will take care of itself. And today's trouble is enough for today." That's in Matthew 6:34, which precedes one of the great verses in the New Testament, Matthew 6:33, which says, "But seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added unto you." And they didn't quite understand that yet, but they would. Now look at verses 11 through 15. It says, "The Lord said to Moses, I've heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God." That evening, quail came and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat." Grumbling. This is characteristic of these people in the desert. The text notes that the people grumbled, and they directed their grumbling at Moses. But actually, if they're against Moses, if they're negative toward Moses, they're negative toward God, because Moses is God's representative. Have a short memory. But God's going to say at this point, you won't have to have that short memory anymore, because I'm going to provide for you daily. Meat in the evening, bread in the morning. In this case, they would be filled with food to provide the demonstration that God was going to make for them. And that would be for 40 years. Hopefully at the end of 40 years, they would say, yeah, God's taking care of us. The quail that are mentioned here in this part of Exodus, probably not the quail that we see. They're probably a migratory bird, still good to eat, but this was a one-time event. The manna in the morning would be a daily event. Every day you pick up the manna and have bread that's available to you for all day. And the obvious challenge for the Jews here is to trust that God's going to give them something every day. Every day. You pick up enough for one day, God said. Pick up enough for one day, and then tomorrow there'll be enough for the next day. That shows faith if you're willing to say, okay, I just pick up enough for today. What they found out is that if you pick up more than enough, what's left over will spoil before the next day. And the word that comes here is called manna. It is really a translation of what they said. What is it? Manna means, what is it? Well, it was bread, and it was for their consumption. Look at verses 16 through 19. "This is what the Lord has commanded. Each one is to gather as much as he needs. Take an omer," which is about 2 quarts, for each person you have in your tent." The Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some little. And when they measured it by the omer, he who gathered much did not have too much, and he who gathered little did not have too little. Each one gathered as much as he needed. Then Moses said to them, "No one is to keep any of it until the morning. It'll be there again." You have to have faith. God wanted to see that faith. He wanted to see it demonstrated. He was going to demonstrate that he would supply their needs. Now you demonstrate to me that you believe what I'm saying. Practiced for 40 years. It worked for 40 years. And so what God is saying, if it worked for 40 years, you think it'll continue to work? You think if you demonstrate your faith in me that I'm still going to supply for your needs? You bet it is. And that's what he does for us every day. Whatever the manna was, the biblical record is clear. In the moment of Israel's need for food, the Lord providentially answered, and they gathered whatever they needed for each day. The narrative beautifully illustrates the great truth of God's ever-sustaining providence, even for us. He supplies the food that these people needed. He cares for them, cares for their needs. He makes the food which he gives them the vehicle of spiritual lessons. Beginning here and throughout the Bible and in Christian tradition, manna becomes a metaphor for God's grace and providence for us all. Manna from heaven. Look at chapter 17, verses 1 through 7. It says, "The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, 'Give us water to drink.' Moses replied, 'Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?' But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, 'Why did you bring us out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?' Then Moses cried out to the Lord, 'What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me.' The Lord answered Moses, 'Walk on ahead of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take you in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock of Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink.' So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. And they called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, 'Is the Lord among us or not?'" They still don't have faith. Now it's a big demonstration. Moses strikes the rock at Horeb, and water flows out of the rock, enough for them all. The whole Israelite community. Huge amount of water, and that's what they needed. Eventually, God would lead them to Rephidim, and they would find that there's no water, and God would send the water from the rock. God's saying to them over and over, "Trust me. Trust me. Don't try to look way out in the future. Trust me today. Trust me today, and then trust me again tomorrow." God's only response to Israel's insolence was to provide water and to remind them that Moses was his servant. And he sends them the bread of life every day in manna. And he sends water out of the rock. You know, Christ becomes the spiritual rock. John 6:35 calls him. And Jesus continues to be furnished rivers of living water for his people. We always equate Jesus with the manna, with the water. He is the one that gives us life. There's another dramatic demonstration of God's power and provision in these verses and the next verses that come. We'll not read all of those, but it's a story at Rephidim of an encounter between the Israelites and the Amalekites, lifelong enemies of the children of Israel. And it's a story of Moses going up on a high place and Joshua leading the forces of Israel against the Amalekites. And Moses raises up his arms, and as long as he holds his arms up in the air, they prevail on the battlefield. When his arms get weak and they start falling down, they start losing the battle. And so people come and hold Moses' arms up for him. And eventually they prevail. They prevail in the battle. And it is again a sign that God is taking care of them. Now, after this battle is over, there comes a visitor to the camp, someone that Moses knows. It's company for him. Look in chapter 18, verses 1 through 7. Now Jethro, the priest of Midian and the father-in-law of Moses, heard of everything God had done for Moses and for his people Israel, and how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. And Moses had sent away his wife Zipporah. His father-in-law Jethro received her and her 2 sons. One son was named Gershom, for Moses said, I have become an alien in a foreign land. And the other was named Eliezer, for he said, my father's God was my helper. He saved me from the sword of Pharaoh. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, together with Moses' sons and wife, came to him in the desert, and where he camped near the mountain of God. Jethro had sent word to him, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons. So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and bowed down and kissed him. They greeted each other and then went into their tent. Here's his father-in-law. Moses spent 40 years working for Jethro. They knew each other well. They could speak frankly with one another. And that's what we find Jethro doing at this point. The first thing that he does, he offers praise to God. These are verses 8 through 19. We're not going to read all of those. Offers praise to God and an offering to God, a burnt offering, and sacrifices that to God. And then he notices something the next day about Moses. Moses spends all day listening to cases from the people. You got all these people out in the desert. There are going to be controversies, and people are going to want somebody to help them settle those things. And he watches and says, to himself, Moses is wasting his time on all this. Somebody else could be handling this. So he goes to Moses and he tells him, what you're doing is not good. You're going to wear yourself out if you try to accomplish all of this. I'm going to give you some advice. And the advice he's going to give him is, you need to kind of share the burden here a little bit. That's a problem that people run into who get into positions of authority. I can remember as a high school principal having to recognize this. 1,700 kids, a faculty of nearly 100. You got to spread out the authority, and you got to get other people involved in making an operation like that run. Look how many people Moses had, and he's out in the desert. He definitely needed some help. He needed to learn to delegate some of that authority to other people. Doing it all yourself won't do anything but do you in. You won't be able to do much else but do the day-to-day listening of these cases, and you'll not be able to really accomplish what God says for you to do. So look at the sound advice that Jethro gives to Moses in verses 20 through 23 in chapter 18. He says, teach them the decrees and laws and show them the way to live and the duties they are to perform. He said, select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Have them serve as judges for the people at all times, but have them bring every difficult case to you. The simple cases they can decide themselves. That will make your load lighter because you will share it with it. They will share it with you. If you do this, and God so commands, you'll be able to stand the strain, and all the people will go home satisfied. Moses, there's a better way. There's a better way. You don't need to wear yourself out here in every case. There's undoubtedly some responsible men. He says select capable men. Capable men. Don't select people who can't do it. Select people you know who can do it. But more importantly, he says, select men who fear God. People who are trustworthy and who hate dishonest gain. we find that to be one of the real problems in governmental positions that people have. They get into a governmental position and a way to get some dishonest gain, make themselves rich. Jethro says, Moses, you don't want people like that who will turn to dishonest gain. You want people who are trustworthy, people who are capable, and people who fear God, and they'll be your best people for this thing that I'm asking you to do. And have all the difficult cases brought to you, but all the day-to-day, run-of-the-mill cases, let these people handle that. And he says, if you do this, you'll be able to stand up under the strain. You'll be able to make it. Teach them laws and decrees. You'll be able to stand up under the strain each and every day. Now look at verses 24 through 27. In verse 24 it says, Moses listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. He chose capable men from all Israel, made them leaders of the people, officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. They served as judges for the people at all times. The difficult cases they brought to Moses, but the simple ones they decided themselves. Then Moses sent his father-in-law on his way, and Jethro returned to his own country. This little incident with Jethro, it wasn't a father-in-law meddling. It was a friend of Moses was telling him some sound advice. Remember, Moses spent 40 years working for Jethro. He knew Jethro pretty well, and he was not at all threatened by Jethro's advice. In fact, he thought it was sound advice, and he followed it. Paige Kelly's commentary captures the issues of this episode as Israel's going across the desert here. And he says, God's matchless grace shines through in all of the splendor of these chapters. He came to the relief of the Israelites time and time again. Then when they murmured and complained, God's response to a faithless, complaining people was one of love and compassion. And part of that was Jethro coming along. If Moses would have continued to try to handle all this, he would have failed. But Jethro said, spread it out. Let other people help you. God's marvelous deliverance of the Red Sea, that was a one-time thing, and now you're down to the mundane daily chores that you have to go through. You know, life is not filled with crossing the Red Sea every day. Life is filled with lots of other things, and you have to handle those things. In fact, the people wanted to know, what shall we eat? What shall we drink? Who will take care of us? That's a daily thing. And if you don't take care of those things, they're going to be on your case. This is an apt description of the attitude that we often assume. Although we've trusted God to save us from sin and death, we often fail to trust Him from our daily bread. My salvation and my baptism, that was a one-time event. The rest of life goes on. And so we find ourselves in that wilderness of life going along, and we're not trusting God like we should daily. God is here and says He wants to supply our daily needs. It's difficult for us to remember that God's going to supply our daily needs. We look for the big things in life, and those events occur, but day by day by day by day. I remember taking a reading course in Russian literature, not reading it in Russian but in English, but reading in Tolstoy. And one of the things that Tolstoy emphasizes in his stories over and over, it's not the sea that drowns you. You recognize the sea. It's the mud puddles of life that drown you. They sneak up on you. And so that's sort of what God and what Jethro was saying to Moses, and Moses learned that. We find ourselves in the wilderness between the Red Sea and the Promised Land, and we get bogged down in the little things. But God's provision is there. But God demands absolute trust in that provision for life. I like the way that Alexander McLaren describes what we need to learn as Christians. It is the same thing that the Hebrews learned in their day-to-day dependence on God to supply their daily needs while they're making their way from the Red Sea to the Promised Land, 40 years. Listen to what McLaren said. Only he who absolutely trusted God to provide for him, would eat his portion of manna and lie down at night with a quiet heart, knowing that he who had fed him today would feed him tomorrow. God could have provided at once all that would have lasted the people throughout the wilderness life, but he willed instead to let his gifts come in a day-by-day, hand-to-mouth fashion for the continued training of or testing of faith. God wanted the people to test the peace and strength that comes from continual dependence and the joy that overflows from continual receiving. Day by day, God said, I'm going to supply your needs. I want you to have faith that it's going to be there. Therefore, don't collect more manna than you need, just the amount that you need. It'll be there again in the morning. Trust me, God said. Trust me. That's developing faith. As we walk through this life as Christians, we have to trust that God's going to be with us every day, every step of the way. It's not just the big things that we can expect God to be present. He's going to be present in our life every day, and He's going to be there to take care of every need. Warren Wiersbe agrees that when by faith we walk with the Lord, then the life is a school, and the successful pilgrim student can pray with Moses, so teach us to number our days that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom. Number your days. We're looking for God's guidance 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and God will do it. He will guide us. He will provide for us. I love the old hymn, Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah. It's drawn from actually the experience of Israel in the barren land. They travel from Egypt to Canaan, and the song's original 5 stanzas note the biblical reference through and through. For example, the bread of heaven, the crystal clear pure stream from the flowing rock, the fire and the cloudy pillar, the deliverance from bondage, and songs of praises. William Williams is the hymn writer here. He was born in Landover, Wales, the son of a wealthy farmer. But at the age of 20, Williams completed his studies to be a medical doctor, and he was in a service where he heard the well-known evangelist Howell Harris, and he heard the call of God on his life to follow him. And he became an itinerant preacher who preached for 43 years, not in one single church, but all throughout Wales. It's estimated that he traveled over 100,000 miles on horseback, preaching the Word of God. And it so well captured God in a hymn that is a testimony to faith. Here's what the hymn says. I'm going to sing the first verse and then we'll read the others. It says, Guide me, O Thou great Jehovah, pilgrim through this barren land. I am weak, but Thou art mighty. Hold me with Thy powerful hand. Bread of heaven, feed me till I want no more. Feed me till I want no more. And then he says, Open now the crystal fountain, whence the healing stream doth flow. Let the fire and cloudy pillar lead me all my journey through. Strong deliverer, be Thou still my strength and shield. Be Thou still my strength and shield. When I tread the verge of Jordan, bid my anxious fears subside. Bear me through the swelling current. Land me safe on Canaan's side. Songs of praises, I will ever give to Thee. I will ever give to Thee. And all along life's journey, God's going to be with us. He's going to be with us every day if we give Him our trust. And if we look to Him for guidance, He's going to supply the manna every day. And we can count on it. You can count on it too. If you haven't given your heart to Jesus, I hope you will. Have a good week.